Hello everybody, welcome back to another video by Jay Bowman. I recently received a request from a viewer to talk about the lenses I use for macro, family and wildlife photography. This is something I had been thinking about doing for a while now, so I intend this video to be the first in a series looking at the lenses I use for these genres of photography. So this video is about the lenses I use for wildlife photography. It's principally going to be about this lens, the Sigma APO Macro 150mm f2.8 EX DG HSM. It's a bit of an unusual lens to use for wildlife, so I have quite a bit of explaining to do. But don't worry, I will try to present lots of images to illustrate my various points along the way. I will repeat again that I am not a professional photographer. I'm not sponsored by any company or individual. And unfortunately, no camera manufacturers send me lenses or other freebies. So my perspective is of a somewhat enthusiastic amateur. The last thing in the world I would want to be is an influencer. And rather than inducing anyone to buy this lens, I suspect this video is going to present a cautionary tale to potential purchasers. So if you are interested in the Sigma 150mm lens and how it performs as a wildlife lens, and what alternative lenses I have considered, stick around, as this is the video for you. Olympus 300mm f4 Pro. So strangely enough, this story starts with the Olympus 300mm f4 Pro. This lens would probably be my ultimate ideal wildlife lens. Unfortunately, I do not have a copy of the lens to show you, as I do not own it. It is undoubtedly a beautiful lens and a lens I would absolutely love to own someday. But so far I've been unable to justify buying the lens, as until recently the focus of my photography was almost entirely on my family and capturing everyday family life, rather than wildlife. So back in 2021, you might say to torture myself, I hired the 300mm Pro for a couple of weeks and used it to take the photos I'm showing now. As always, I'm not claiming that any of the photos I show are the best photos in the world, but I want to illustrate the type of subjects I would shoot with this type of lens, which is local wildlife, small birds, deer, the occasional squirrel, and anything else which crosses my path. Now, a lot of these photos are quite heavy crops, but the quality of the lens is so good that it produces photos that can withstand cropping. The subject is sharp and the bokeh is pretty nice and creamy. So as far as I'm concerned, this is the gold standard for wildlife lenses on Micro Four Thirds. Mirage 135mm f2.8. So after I returned the 300mm f4 Pro to the hire company, I didn't have much call for a wildlife lens until a few years later when I was lucky enough to take a holiday in the Caribbean with my family. This holiday was not a photography trip, let alone a wildlife photography trip, but while I was packing, I did look around at home to see if I had anything I could potentially use to take photos of local wildlife while I was out there. And what I came across in my loft is this old M42 mount lens. It's a Mirage 135mm f2.8, which is apparently a lens made in South Korea. This lens would have been a gift to me from either my father or my mother-in-law. Both of them used to shoot Pentax film cameras, so I've inherited quite a lot of old Pentax lenses and paraphernalia from each of them over the years. So a 135mm lens in 35mm film terms would have been a type portrait lens, but adapted to Micro Four Thirds with the 2x crop factor, this lens became a 270mm equivalent lens. So still too short for birds, but just about usable perhaps for some lizards and insects. Now, unfortunately, the lens does not focus particularly close. The minimum focusing distance is 4.5 feet. But it is at least relatively small and light, and bright with the maximum aperture of f2.8. As an aside, this is just another reminder of how lucky we are with the native Micro Four Thirds lenses, which have minimum focusing distances which are much closer than so-called equivalent lenses from other systems. Please excuse this minor digression. So I took this 135mm lens with me on holiday. Now the positive aspect of this lens is that it had been a while since I'd used a fully manual lens, rather than the focus by wire system which is implemented in most modern autofocus lenses. And this properly damped manual focus action does give a lovely feeling of connection with the lens and the focusing process. It's a bit like driving a fully manual car again, whereas the modern focus by wire action is more like driving an automatic. However, the image quality from the lens is pretty awful. So unfortunately, when I came home, I found that although the experience of taking the photos was thoroughly enjoyable, the photos themselves left a lot to be desired. Now, I don't want to tar all vintage lenses with the same brush, but I don't think the Mirage is particularly unusual in its defects when used on a modern digital camera. When shot wide open, the photos are extremely soft with low contrast and saturation, but not really in a good way. Stopping down does make the photos a bit sharper, but it introduces all sorts of harshness into the bokeh and some nasty artifacts. There's just one photo I got of a dragonfly in a meadow, where I feel the optical qualities of the lens actually work in favour of the image. Shot wide open at minimum focusing distance, in this instance the softness of the lens does contribute something positive to the somewhat dreamlike atmosphere. But that must be just about the only one out of many hundreds of photos I took with that lens, where I could say I'm pleased with the way the lens rendered the scene. Sigma 150mm f2.8. So when I returned home, I started to think about whether there was a better lens I could get to use for wildlife without breaking the bank. I quite liked the 135mm focal length of the Mirage lens, but obviously I preferred the image quality of the Olympus 300mm f4 Pro. From my experience with the Mirage lens, I had convinced myself that I could just about cope with using a manual focus lens for wildlife, although if my chosen wildlife lens could autofocus, then so much the better. In my internet research, I came across some photos taken using the Sigma 150mm f2.8, and honestly, I recall being blown away by the image quality produced by this lens. The photos I saw were wildlife photos, not macro, and they had a lot of the crisp, sharp quality of the 300mm f4, and the bokeh was not too bad either. So once I learned that this Sigma lens was available in the 4/3 mount and at a reasonable price, I decided that this was the lens for me. Now, if I had my time again, I probably would have considered the Olympus 40-150mm f2.8 Pro as a better but more expensive alternative to the Sigma. I've never used the 40-150mm, but it looks like a very good lens from everything I've seen. At the time, I never even considered it as an option, due to my fairly long-standing prejudice against zooms in favour of prime lenses. My feelings on this subject are starting to change now, but until recently, I had not used a zoom lens in anger in more than 15 years. So for this reason, I did not consider the 40-150mm, but probably should have. In fact, there are probably other micro 4/3 lenses and even adapted lenses I should have considered as an alternative and didn't. But for various reasons, I had settled on the Sigma 150mm f2.8 macro, and fairly quickly managed to find a decent copy on eBay for a reasonable price. The copy I bought was in reasonable quality, but it was missing the tripod foot. The lens was sent from Japan, so I believe there was some import duty to pay on top of what I paid the seller through eBay. Now, to get from 150mm to 300mm, so I could be at the same focal length as the Olympus Pro lens, I also needed an EC20 2x teleconverter. So I also got one of these on eBay. Again, there may have been some import duty on this. The final piece of the puzzle to assemble this Franken lens monster is this MMF1 4/3 to micro 4/3 adapter. Now, I did not need to buy this adapter, since when I bought my first Micro Four Thirds camera, this EP2, the MMF1 adapter came bundled with the camera. Obviously, at the time, Olympus wanted adopters of its new Micro Four Thirds system to be able to use their existing 4/3 lenses on the new cameras. However, as I did not have any 4/3 lenses, this adapter had sat unused in my loft for nearly 14 years across 3 separate house moves until finally starting to see some use in 2024. I must confess that finally getting to use it after all that time did give me a feeling of vindication. It's important to say that neither the Sigma 150mm lens, nor the EC20 adapter, nor the MMF1 are in production anymore, so second-hand is your only option for these items. As yet another aside, let me point out that in this video, I'm only considering the Sigma 150mm as a wildlife lens, not specifically as a macro lens. I will likely cover this aspect in a future video. Hardware. So let's talk about the hardware of the lens. It has a sort of matte coating, which is quite nice to the touch, although you can see it is starting to wear away in some places, and a more plasticky looking material is now showing through underneath. The lens feels nice and solid in the hand, and it's pretty well balanced on the OM1 II, but it is definitely a two-handed lens, particularly given the weight of the lens and the fact that I'm using these adapters. It has a manual focusing ring at the front, which feels pretty nice, although it is definitely what I would call focus by wire. It has a switch for autofocus and manual focus, which I never use because I use back button focus for this type of photography. And finally, it has a 3-way focusing limiting switch to limit the focus from 38 centimeters up to 52 centimeters, or from 52 centimeters to infinity, or to remove all of the limits and allow access to the full focus range. I nearly always leave this switch on full, whatever I am shooting. One of the benefits of using this lens is that if I am photographing an insect at macro range and spot a bird, I can go from shooting the one to the other quite quickly. But if I have to fumble with this switch, then that just gets in the way and inevitably causes me to miss shots. Image quality. Now let's talk about image quality. What I'm going to show here is a selection of the photos I took with this lens in the first few weeks and months after I got it. These were all taken with the EM1 III. So this is some local wildlife, but also during this period we took a trip up to Northumberland, where I shot the puffins, the hare, and some of the other birds you see here. In terms of the bare lens without the teleconverter, I think the image quality is great. It's about as good as I could want in a lens. It's nice and sharp, the contrast and saturation is great, but also the bokeh is pretty good, if perhaps a step down from the creamier bokeh of the 300mm. Overall, the image quality is probably not quite as good as the 300mm F4 Pro, but it's not a million miles from that level of quality. I think this is partly because this lens was designed for full frame bodies, and so by only using the central portion of the glass, Micro Four Thirds is flattering the lens and making it perform even better than it would likely do on a full frame body. With the teleconverter on, the images lose some sharpness as you would expect, and inevitably the images will be noisier as the maximum aperture reduces to f5.6, necessitating a higher ISO unless you have the scope to reduce shutter speed. If you can afford to stop the lens down to f8 while using it with the teleconverter, then the images will sharpen up slightly to a more acceptable image quality. Autofocus. So now let's talk about autofocus and focusing generally. Unfortunately, this is the weak point of the lens. So this lens does just about autofocus on my EM5 III, my EM1 III, and my OM1 II. The autofocus on my OM1 II seems to operate marginally quicker than it was on the EM1 III. However, I'm not sure that the focus is any more reliable than it was on the EM1 III. Reliability is a big problem with this lens. If you depend on the camera confirming that it has acquired focus, then you will be disappointed when you check focus later on. Nearly all of the shots I show with this lens have been manually focused, at least to an extent. Autofocus will get you in the generally correct focal range, but in order to get that last 5% of sharpness, you will need to use the magnify view and check focus. That's the only way to guarantee focus in the field. Obviously, wildlife will not always be content to stick around while you confirm that focus. As another aside, I should mention again that the EM1 III allows autofocus with this lens in magnify view, but the OM1 II does not, which is one of the few points in favour of the EM1 III over the OM1 II. Since manual focus is essential, let's talk about the experience of manually focusing this lens. Now, before I started using this lens, I did not appreciate how difficult using a manual focus macro lens as a general purpose wildlife lens would be. Let me illustrate the problem for you. So a half turn of this focusing ring takes us from 38 centimeters to about 1 meter. Now a further fifth turn of the focusing ring takes us from 1 meter to infinity. What this means is that if I am focusing on a bird or a hare or a deer or whatever it is, say 5 meters away, it's incredibly finicky to get accurate focus because you have such little distance to play with on the focusing ring. But if you do get that focus, then the shot will invariably look glorious. Conclusion. By way of conclusion, I'll now show some of my more recent shots taken with the Sigma 150mm on my OM1 II. Let's see what points we can learn from these shots. So this shot of a squirrel undermines what I've said previously about focus. The EXIF data tells me that this was shot using the bird's subject detect mode. So this is one of the rare occasions where autofocus has actually nailed focus. This is taken at 300mm at f8 1/80, and it looks pretty good. With some denoising, it would sharpen up pretty nicely. The lens is not weather sealed, although I have shot it several times in heavy rain and not experienced any issues. This shot of a duck, shot in the heavy rain, does however illustrate the perils of relying on the autofocus without confirming focus manually. If you zoom in, you will see that the plane of focus is behind the duck's head, which is a shame. This photo of a dolphin I've spoken about previously. I'll put a link to my previous discussion of this photo here, but this is one of my favourite shots I've taken with this lens. Now this shot isn't strictly a wildlife shot, but I did want to use it to illustrate one of the unexpected positives of this lens, which is that although it does not feature any type of optical stabilization, for some reason I can take handheld photos with this lens at absurdly slow shutter speeds. I mentioned this photo in my most recent video. It was shot with the Sigma 150mm handheld by me standing in a field with no support at 1/3 of a second, and it is very sharp. Obviously, these slow shutter speeds only work for wildlife which is prepared to sit still for you, but the f2.8 maximum aperture, combined with this ability to hold steady at slow shutter speeds, does expand the shooting envelope of this lens beyond what you might expect. This shot of a squirrel at 150mm I like because it sums up how I feel shooting with this lens. I'm at a distance, there is a sense of calm about the scene, and to be frank, that is the type of shot you will get with this lens. Because of the difficulty in focusing, it is unlikely you will be taking photos with this lens where there is movement in or out of the frame by the subject. so it does tend to steer you towards this type of calm shot. Something else I want to talk about is that I probably had the 2x teleconverter in my pocket at the time when I took the shot. I have got pretty good at putting the teleconverter on and taking it off quickly in the field, so I maybe could have tried to get the shot at 300mm as well as 150mm. But I think the photo works well at this focal length, where the viewer is suspended above the water channel at a slightly voyeurish distance from the subject. This blackbird I love. It's a heavy crop, about 1/4 the size of the full frame, but it shows that if you nail focus with this lens, you can crop to your heart's content, as it is sharp enough to bear it, just like the Olympus 300mm F4 Pro. The blackbird hopped over to the other side of the path, and I took some more photos, including this one of her eating berries. But this one is my pick of the bunch. I think it is a lovely shot of the blackbird in situ, and for our purposes it does illustrate some slightly quirky bokeh in the leaves above the blackbird's head, which is there if you focus on it, and is somewhat less than ideal. But by contrast, the bokeh in the foreground is pretty nice and nicely handled, and the blackbird herself is so crisp that the bokeh is more of an afterthought. These photos of a crow are straight out of camera. They feature some classic poses. The bird is flying but not getting anywhere in the wind. However, it is a shame that if you inspect closely you will quickly realise that the shots are out of focus. If you use this lens, you have to get used to this sort of thing. In theory, where this lens comes into its own is in photos of stationary larger birds. But it's unfortunate that if you really zoom in on this cormorant, you will see here that again I've just missed focus, which illustrates that even with magnify view it can be tricky to get the focus by wire manual focus bang on the bird. But to conclude, let's round off this video with an undoubted triumph. This photo of a heron catching a perch, taken at 300mm f5.6, shows what can be achieved with a bit of patience and a lot of luck. Undoubtedly, this shot would have been better if I'd taken it with the 300mm f4 Pro. The ISO would have been a stop lower, the focus would have been a bit sharper, the background would have been a bit smoother. But it's very possible I would not have taken this shot at all with the 300mm f4 Pro, because this shot was not taken on a wildlife shoot. This was a photo taken en route to a destination where I was planning to shoot some mushrooms. I was travelling pretty light with a couple of lenses and the 2x teleconverter, whereas I suspect that if I did have the 300mm, I would have reserved it purely for dedicated wildlife photography trips. So this is a photo taken on the same journey before I took the heron shot at 150mm. The Sigma 150mm gives me quite a flexible setup for shooting at 150mm in low light at f2.8, or with longer reach at 300mm at f5.6, in configurations which fit in a couple of jacket pockets. Shooting with this lens involves quite a lot of frustration. There are missed shots and misfocused shots aplenty, but when the lens hits, it's really great. So I want to conclude by saying my main wildlife lens, the Sigma 150mm f2.8, has a great optical quality but poor autofocus. Clearly it was not designed to be a wildlife lens, but with a bit of luck and patience, it can serve in that role. Would I recommend this lens to anyone else who isn't a masochist? Absolutely not. Am I glad that I got it? Yes. Am I looking to upgrade at some point to something better? Absolutely. As always, if you have made it this far, thank you very much for watching. Please do give me a like and a subscribe. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will catch you on the next one. Goodbye.